This conference will now be recorded.
All right, Pat, it is over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you folks for joining us today. The topic is recruitment and retention, finding and keeping quality employees in small communities. And as usual, this project is made by the wonderful Library and Services Technology Act from the Institute of Museum and Libraries, administered by the South Carolina State Library as well. And we should all be grateful for the funding for programs like this. So this program is really aimed at small libraries and small communities, but I want to tell you that my experience and also for the record, probably 2/3 of the work that I do is with small and medium-sized communities. And when I say small, I've worked in towns of 300, okay? So small, but even bigger libraries have the issues. Some of the things we're going to be talking about today, I've even seen state libraries have this issue of finding candidates to come in for a variety of reasons. If there's a key idea for the program, the key idea is grow your own. And it has to do with how we treat our existing employees and how we create a magnet for people in our community who might want to work for the library and what that means and how to accomplish that. So there are several outcomes that we hope happen. First and most important is to really understand that particularly if in a small community, it's likely that other agencies, businesses, nonprofit organizations, government agencies share the same issues about recruitment and retention that you do. So it's really good to build a network of people who have similar issues so that you can work together to create pools of employees. Um, a training program to attract new hires is very much about realizing that you have an investment to make in people. And I know when you're small and poor, it's sometimes difficult to feel like you can spend resources on things like training and cross-training and development. But long ago, they did a study, and this was during the dot-com era, where we had the crash of not dozens, but hundreds and thousands of businesses in a relatively short period of time. And the study they did looked at businesses that cut back all of the what they considered excess funding, money they were spending on personnel and marketing and the ones. And we just like to remind people that you need to mute your mic, if you would please. Thank you very much. Uh, the ones who didn't cut back, and what the study showed, and not more than one study showed, that people, businesses, and agencies during times of financial crisis who actually increased training, increased marketing, bounced back much faster when the financial crisis was over than people who felt they were being fiscally responsible by cutting a lot of things back. So this is something to think about when you're saying, how are we going to spend our funding when we're small and we think every penny has to go to programming and collections? And then finally, to be able to partner with educational institutions. And educational institutions, of course, include library schools, but they also include community colleges, advanced placement programs in high schools, universities in your area, to talk about the kind of people you need and what you're looking for. And a lot of times you have programs in your area that serve what we like to call non-traditional students. So we're not talking about the 18 to 22-year-old crowd that still lives at home or in dorms. We're talking about working adults with families who are doing career changes. And I know a lot of libraries who have found great candidates who are already seasoned with workplace experience and are people who are looking for new adventures. And libraries are certainly a great adventure to be in. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about that whole idea of what it means to have to work with a very small pool of potential candidates. I love science fiction and fantasy, and I was a big fan, still am, of the Buffy series. And those of us who watched Buffy knew that Buffy was a vampire slayer. And waiting in the wings was always people who could be the next Slayer, and they were called potentials. And I always loved that line. So we're talking about the potentials out there, the potential Slayers, and in this case, the potentials who work for libraries. The fact that people don't work just for money, I think, is an important thing to understand. What it means to always be recruiting even before the need is there. And we'll talk a little bit about how professional employment agencies like temporary agencies and people who are headhunters see the idea of how they recruit and how to adapt that to your needs. Cultivating pipelines to good employees inside and outside the library. And then briefly, we're going to be talking about two special groups that we tend to overlook. Very young people and very old people, old being anyone older than I am, and I'm almost 69. And then military folks, retirees, stay-at-homes, and students. There's a whole bunch of people out there we tend to overlook. And then we're going to summarize everything with a little 6 or 7 step, do this, do this, do this, and see if some of these ideas can work for you. I wish I had an instant solution. I don't, but the ideas I'm going to be talking about are ideas that your colleagues around the United States have used. So they're not just theory. I've seen them in practice, and maybe one of them can work for you. So first of all, what does it mean when you have a small pool of potential employees? First thing is, and I am not paid extra to do this, but the idea of working with your state library to look at what are the guidelines, which can be changing. They're going to be updating those guidelines having to do with standards for how libraries, particularly public libraries, operate in your state, and see how you can, with the leadership of your library, create new goals, not just for the current people, but the future people are there as well. Sometimes, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, we get a little too comfortable. And I'm amazed as I go around the United States how many libraries don't take advantage of what their state libraries can offer and don't negotiate with them. I mean, state libraries know about small libraries. They know about the challenges that you have. So make sure that you're working with them and they know what you're looking for and so on. So the first thing I tell people that they need to do is not to look outside for new candidates, but to look inside at the library and say, is this a place that somebody who doesn't know anybody in town, doesn't know how Grumpy Madge really has a heart of gold, doesn't know, well, yeah, the old air conditioner doesn't work, but that's okay because it's South Carolina. How sometimes we get too close to stuff and we have figured out the workarounds, but that doesn't mean a new person coming in is going to settle for what we put up with. And it's not just about how much money there is. One thing that is almost the elephant in the room for a lot of libraries I visit is that because the same staff has been there for years, if not decades, people have gotten comfortable with each other's eccentricities. And so we might say, well, Pat's a wonderful person, but she hates teenage boys, so we never have her in the front with the teenage boys. We just lock her in the back in tech services and don't let her out the front. Or, yeah, when we hold meetings, Pat's the one who sort of dominates all the meetings. Basically, what we say is that we don't have standards for how we conduct ourselves, and we let some people get away with stuff. So what I tell people when they're job hunting is to see what the written expectations are. What do the job descriptions say, and how are people held accountable regardless of who they are? So the first thing is are there guidelines to basically say, yes, this is how we do our work without exception? The second thing is are all people treated with respect and courtesy? Now, I know that places like South Carolina, everyone polite, sweet, that's not the issue. But if a new person comes up with a new idea, are they immediately put down and does someone say, well, wait till you're here 5 years, then we'll listen to you? Or will the ideas be listened to? Is there room for innovation? Is there room for having people come up to speed because they're valued, not just another warm body? So what I look for is a place where you walk into the library and people are smiling at each other. They like each other and they're smiling at strangers. And that it isn't simply like you're not old enough or you're not experienced enough or we're so special that we're going to reject any new ideas that you might have. We also have to take a look at the people who are already there. You know, in terms of what we're doing and what are we trying to do, Do we have our job expectations up to date? And I know that this can open a can of worms, particularly if you've had long-term employees who maybe have gotten, as I say, a little comfy and there's a little slippage. And one director told me, and this was in a prosperous suburb, that he was working on the introduction to a new strategic plan. They were just in the beginning of the strategic planning process. And he said, I realized that I was censoring myself, that I was rejecting ideas because I thought, oh, well, Pat's on the staff and she will never go for that. So we aren't even going to bother to put it in the strategic plan. Or we were going to do this outreach to new Americans, but Pat doesn't like immigrants. Or we were going to do more stuff for older people or children or whatever it was. And then we think the people who are blocking us aren't the people outside, the people who are actually on the staff. And that's usually because that we don't make growth and change part of the requirement for working in our library. And I have been in those rooms with people who have worked at the library for 20 or 25 years, are asked to change, and they feel betrayed. I haven't done anything wrong. And it's really hard sometimes to explain to people they're fine, but the world has changed. It's a different world than it was in library land, even from 5 or 10 years ago. So are we putting in place those things to prepare for change? And given the number of people we have and who does their job well and so on, are we actually being realistic about what we can offer? Or do we have to scale back some of our programming and services so that what we do may be less, but it's of the highest quality? And I think those kind of soul searching things need to happen before you bring new people into your library. These are the kinds of questions that a good candidate is going to ask you, and they're going to be asking other people and watching and listening for. And again, we're going to pretend that if it's an outside candidate coming in, they've never lived in town, they don't have a history with the library. So you know what? They're seeing everything with fresh eyes. In fact, it isn't too different from trying to sell a house. Nothing is more humiliating in my experience than trying to sell your house and have the real estate agent come in and you're saying, oh, I love this, I love this. And they're looking and they're saying, oh my goodness, you're going to have to repaint everything. You're going to have to clean up the old garden. Oh, we're going to have to buy new furniture because you may have loved this stuff for 30 years, but it's going to appeal to someone coming in for the first time. I almost think we should hire real estate agents to come in just to be like interior decorators, to make sure that we are doing things in a fresh and new fashion, something that is appealing to people today. So, and I underline this because I think this is sometimes the reason that we get in trouble. It's, and I'm sort of exaggerating here, and I used a goldfish, also known as a carp, because they're the oldest living fish. They can live for like a zillion years. So I'm going to read this out loud. Please don't harbor bullies and less productive employees just because they've worked for your library for 100 years. And I realize there's going to be hurt feelings and anger and so on. But and I'm not saying move out the old for the new, because it's not about that. It's about, I don't care how old they are or who they are. But if you have a person or persons on the staff who make it difficult for everyone else, even if you're able to hook a great employee, trust me, they're not going to stay very long once they figure out what's going on. I felt for the sake of honesty that I needed to say something about part-timers. In too many places I visit, part-timers are an expedient way to fill in the budget because we'll get this person for 2 hours or this person for 3 hours. And what we forget is it actually takes more time and money to supervise someone who's part-time than full-time. And there's often less consistency in how they do things. More mistakes are made because they're distracted, takes a little time for them to get up to speed. And also, and this is an issue that has come up to me more than once, they're more likely to ignore policies. Oh, I don't care, I'm here part-time. So I tell people that you should really take a look at the downside of having part-timers versus full-timers. And I realize in some cases in a small town, you can't pay for folks, but we forget to include the cost to your leadership, to your director and managers and supervisors, and how much time it takes to supervise. That's a cost. That's part of a line item in your budget having to do with personnel, which is the biggest part of your budget. So make sure that choosing to have mostly part-timers at your library is not what we call a false economy. On the other hand, and this happened at several libraries I've been in, but one sticks in my mind, the idea of subsidizing. Because people say, oh, we love the library and it's this wonderful family. People come in on weekends, they don't clock in. They don't use that time card or time sheet. Or if they're salaried like the director, they spend a huge amount of time doing the work that needs to get done. So we had this small library that was in a rural area about 20 miles outside one of Colorado's bigger cities. It wasn't Denver. Beautiful community, kind of a semi-retirement community with lots of money, had just built a drop-dead gorgeous library, and the community loved the library, supportive financially. Well, the board hadn't been paying attention for about 5 or 6 years. They just knew the library was doing very well until their director was ready to retire. And then the board started to inventory what the person did. And I'm not exaggerating. This woman, who was not married, was working 75 to 80 hours a week on the library. And when the board looked at what she was doing, because they knew in the transition period they would have to take over some of her duties until they found someone new, that it would take 2 or 3 people to replace what she was doing. And I was there for the meetings. I facilitated the board director meetings, preparing for all of this. And the board said she was doing such a good job, we never paid attention. So subsidizing is like a bad drug. It's very addictive, but it leads to pain and sorrow down the road. So you got to be very careful about people who are helping out in your small library and not being paid. In effect, they are volunteering by not being paid. And in most state personnel agencies, that's illegal. That's illegal. And you think the IRS is a problem. Wait till you have to deal with your state personnel agency as well. So these are some things to kind of find out about too. So here's a little exercise, and would be really interested to see what your comments would be. And feel free to comment in the chat, in your chat thing about it. Is what would that potential employee, someone from out of town, doesn't have any ties, has never seen the library, what would they see? How would they view your library? What's the upside of working at your library? On the other hand, what needs to change? And starting that conversation is one of the ways that we start developing not just one tactic for one employee, but a strategy for the people that we hope will work in our library. So feel free in the chat box to put in what you think might be some of the issues that people would have. So here's kind of the little chart that I put together for this, that the upside in our community is loyal and supportive community. They love the library. Popular story hours, beautiful historic Carnegie. The staff is like family. We all get together so well, go to each other's weddings and engagement parties and so on. Our meeting rooms are always filled and busy. We have the people who have library cards are active and they use the library. We have a to die for genealogy collection, and we are rooted in tradition. Well, how does the new person coming into town look at that? Well, loyal and supportive, no fresh faces visit the library. It's the same old, same old. Even though, and comes out of an experience I had in Iowa, even though over 50% of the county is over the age of 50 years old and there's only 10 kids in the county, I'm not exaggerating, small town Iowa, most of the programming is still for kids and there was nothing for people who were over 50. The historic building is beautiful, but it's basically, last time anyone rewired it was 1920, and the fire marshal has already said, we can't put in more electricity in this building. That's a problem. The staff is like family, and it has all the same kind of bickering and angst and soap operas that a family has. that, yeah, the meeting rooms are busy because the same 10 service groups have booked them up for the millennium. That even though we have active library cards, there's a declining number of new signups, and there are new people coming to town who just don't feel the library's for them. Yeah, the historic collection is great, but the general collection needs updating. And even though we're rooted in tradition, hey man, it's like the 21st century. There has to be a balance between the old and new. So you can think about how your library kind of stacks up to those issues as well. Here we go. So another thing that I think is important, and this is homework for all of you, I think the small libraries who do the best are constantly researching what other libraries are doing. The mythology is that we're so unique that nobody else on the planet has our same problems or issues. I'm sorry, that's simply not true. You're special. Everybody's special, but you're not unique. So I encourage you to use online resources, not just to explore libraries in South Carolina, but other libraries in your region and literally in the country. Who else has 3,000 people in a collection this big and this budget? What are they doing with it? How do they deal with the same problems that we have? And I am a big fan of the Association of Small and Rural Libraries is a great place to start learning from libraries all over the United States who share your concerns. So again, when my parents were living through the Depression, they did not care what kind of job they were offered because all they cared about was the money. And it was 1932, and they were from immigrant families and dead broke. And my mother said we didn't job hunt for personal enhancement. We were there to make sure that we didn't starve to death. And I think that kind of thinking is something that people still have to a certain extent. But that's not true. And it hasn't been true for a long time that people just are in it for the money. So it's not just about a job. It's about that you're marketing a career opportunity, even if it's, quote, just, I'm doing air quotes here, just someone who is shelving books. You're also marketing your whole community. What is it about your community that would make somebody want to move there? You know, and it's a lifestyle, that small town lifestyle. It's not just a job. It's not just a job. I remember a library in Nebraska that did a fantastic job working with different people like the Chamber of Commerce and the Visitors Bureau and the Tourism Bureau and so on to create this beautiful, beautiful picture of what it would be like to move to their town. And they got a wonderful director who was there for many years and until his children graduated from high school and he moved on to bigger fish. But he told me that it was that wonderful idea of a place that I was moving to, not just a job, that made the difference for him as well. What is it that employees are concerned about? Well, some want stability, some want advancement. And you're going to have to know in which bucket they fall. They're concerned about the local economy. The big issue these days in every part of the country is housing costs. And in rural America is what we call the food desert issue. I was working with one county recently, and it was about 3,000 people in the town and county. They had 9 bars and not a single grocery store. And to get any kind of decent groceries, you had to drive 40 miles in Colorado over a 10,000-foot mountain pass where it snows 12 months out of the year. Maybe you don't have those mountain passes, but still, this is something someone's got to worry about. And it's why we have to work as a community, not just an individual in our small town issues. For a lot of people who come to work for small town libraries, they might need a second job. I know, for example, in a town of 400, they had a terrific part-time director who had a MLS, but she subsidized that half-time position as director, being a real estate appraiser. I know another person who sold real estate. I know another person who had half interest in a yarn store for tourists about things. If they have kids, they're going to be interested in what health services are offered, how far is the nearest hospital, the nearest clinic, How is the school system, public, private, charter, religious? What kind of activities are there for people? And what about family employment opportunities for people who are coming with a spouse, a partner, whoever? So these are things that we have to be thinking about, not just the job. So this is where we talk about those partnerships. Who can we discuss things with? Uh, I start at the top with the economic development agencies at the county, the regional, the state level, who also are concerned with these issues. What are the statistics? What grants might be available, what we can do to improve the economic situation of our community. Obviously, local and regional government, just not the people who are overseeing the library. Definitely partnerships with chambers of commerce, not just in our town, but in surrounding counties as well. The school districts, of course, colleges and trade schools to talk to guidance counselors about what kind of people are coming and looking for those all important non-traditional students. Real estate agencies are important because they can tell you who's moving into town. What are the housing prices, is how they compare to other communities? Who are you competing with, in effect, and other businesses and companies that are hiring? What kinds of candidates are they looking for? Are you looking for similar people or dissimilar people as well? One thing that's hard sometimes in a small town is that you become resigned. You know, if you want to put a positive spin on it, you're accepting change. But I always say you just sort of starting to feel resigned. And that's when we talk about the good fight, fight for more money and benefits, support for your community, and to see that you have a community foundation in place or a friends group in place for the extra funds. To take a look at people in your community, local businesses and government, recruiting for those political allies who can help raise everybody's boat by saying we have to look at how much we're paying people and what our expectations are. And the idea that advocacy and supporting the importance of libraries all year round is one of the ways to convince people that you got to be paying people more than minimum wage, whatever it is in our part of the community. I always wince when I hear someone on a library board in a small town say, well, we'll just get a couple of bright young people who we can pay minimum wage for in a couple of years. And I said, that kind of degrades everything you're doing. It just says that what we're doing isn't very worthwhile. So here's an interesting way of thinking things. Actually, my husband came up with this as a solution for a computer company he worked with years ago. And I first saw it in place in library land up in Casper, Wyoming, with the director at the time, Bill Nelson. And he told me that he learned this method because he had been in the military for 20 years. He had been an engineer in the Navy, a Seabee, and fairly high up. He coordinated the logistics for Desert Storm and reported directly to the Joint Chief of Staff, and later became a very successful director in Casper. So the issue is employees don't stay. They're there for a year or two or three, then they're gone. And so how can we pretend that this is an advantage rather than saying that this is a problem? So what if we did this? What would change? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the benefit to the library. There are many professions that have a process that might be called an internship, like in the medical profession, or an apprenticeship in the trades. I was a journeyman printer, and I went through what was in effect a 5-year apprenticeship. And people knew that there was a good chance, which happened after I finished my apprenticeship, I might move on to another workplace. But from the union's point of view, it was like we want a pool of well-trained people because it lifts up the whole profession. It sort of says, yes, there's a stamp of approval there. You get a flow of fresh quality talent, people with new ideas coming in with enthusiasm and young brains and looking at things with fresh eyes and so on, that flow of new ideas. Less pressure regarding money because they're not there for stability. They're there to learn and grow. That we help the library build a reputation for innovation. And that reputation for innovation means that new and different people coming into our community see as leaders. There's nothing wrong, as I've said in previous programs for you folks, of balancing out the old and the new. But for some people who work in libraries for a long time, particularly in small towns, it's sometimes like, well, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to shake things up. And I've even had people tell me, well, the older people in town don't want change, and they're very hesitant about change. And then we find out that actually the people in town love change, which is why they're going to the library 15 miles away and not to the older library. It keeps the library current in terms of what's happening with libraries and communities. And also, and this is the plan that both my husband Leif and Bill Nelson came up with, employees then help with recruitment. Those employees who don't seem to be there very long go back and tell their classmates, and they tell people from where they came, and they talk online. I work for a great place and I'm going to be leaving in a few weeks, and I'm looking for someone who might be interested in taking my place. The benefit to the employee is the more varied experience, the new opportunities, more options for their families in terms of what kind of short-term and part-time employment they might have. That success to new employers means I've learned cool things here. I was able to bring it to a new place. I wasn't here long enough to get sucked into the local soap operas going on, but I also was able to bring skills from outside of the libraries. Now, I've just hit you with a whole bunch of stuff about this model. And for someone like Bill Nelson working in Casper, he would visit library schools. And when he was at the big regional conferences, he'd go and talk to the representatives at the library schools, at regional programs in ALA, and say, here's the benefits of living in Casper, really good school system, really good housing, low cost of living, beautiful place, particularly if you like the outdoors. We know you're not going to stay here more than 3 to 5 years, but we'll let you do stuff that maybe somebody else won't let you do fresh out of library school, and you'll build a great resume. And when I was there, their head of reference, who I think was 12 years old, that was bad of me, was leaving, and she was leaving for a top-notch job as a reference library in a well-respected liberal arts college in the Midwest because of the kinds of things that Bill let her do. And Casper, Wyoming is a fiscally and politically conservative community. And they built a library there that the local folks love. So it's not just saying that people of a certain political ilk won't want to go along with this model. However, there's a flip side. And what I'd be really interested in at this point is if you had some comments about what would be some of the questions and concerns about using this particular model. What, in effect, is the downside of this? So feel free as we go through this list of adding some of the things that would concern you if you try to do this. Let's take advantage of the fact that people are going to be here for a short period of time. Here's some of the things that your colleagues have taught me or said to me over the time. Less continuity, lack of commitment. Just like with part-timers, more time spent getting employees up to speed. Some projects are started by a new person, then they're never finished. Not familiar with the community, constant recruiting. It's hard on the permanent staff morale to see that kind of revolving door. And sometimes HR people have told me that given the fact that someone's not there very long, it's difficult in terms of compensating them fairly because compensation often has to do with tenure. So it can get a little goofy in terms of things like payment and benefits and so on about things. So I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but I'd like you to think about the fact that maybe you can take those part-timers and the people who would be the short timers and turn that into an advantage rather than a deficit. So always be recruiting. How do you create this beautiful pool of people? What does this mean? Well, I checked this before I did this program because I wanted to make sure that my statistics were correct. Many years ago, I used to, when I moved around the country, I'd sign up with temporary agencies, and I got to be friends with some of the people there. And later in my career, I did as well. And what they told me, and this would have been in the 70s, 1970s, and 1980s, that the average temp agency would want to have 20 potential candidates in their files for every opening. So I looked online before I did this program to do research on what the current wisdom was. And guess what the statistics say? All those headhunters out there who lurk on LinkedIn, all those folks who recruit new folks, they want, depending on the position, just about 20 people available to check out for any position that they have. That's about the average, even for frontline customer issues. So this is what professional employment agencies know they need to do to find candidates. So digging those wells before you're thirsty means that we have to anticipate the need for the future. We start, of course, with growing the people we already have. Years ago, one of our state libraries in the region, not South Carolina, could not find catalogers. Catalogers did not want to move to the capital city, which was small in the middle of nowhere. So finally, they kind of looked around at the people they had, and they realized they had this really smart secretary working the front desk who had been there forever, did not have a college degree, but probably knew as much about running a library as anybody. They dug up some scholarship money, paid for her college and her master's degree, and she became a top-notch cataloger for the state library at the time. So this idea of growing internal candidates means what can you use to leverage the skill set of people who already live in town, who already are there in families, who already know the library, even though at this point they don't have the credentials and the training that you might want them to have. But there's a negative too. So if you've ever had to deal with these situations, what's the negative of investing in employees, of spending all this extra time and money and training and scholarships and development and so on? Well, some people say, I'm trying to run a library. I'm not trying to run an employment agency or a training organization. So just don't have the time. We get them up to speed, give them these great skills, and they're off to someplace else, right? Um, Not all the people who work for us are folks who are going to want or accept that education. So in effect, we start creating a two-tier system of how people are rewarded. And somehow that doesn't feel fair to us, particularly those old timers who are loyal and have done a very good job. And then what about those people who we've got new demands in place and they refuse to grow? Are we supposed to fire them even though they've been a great employee for many years? So there are some challenges that we have to talk about. What I'm saying is that every solution has a problem and that you can talk about these problems and issues as well. Let me pause here for a second. Tiffany, I'd like to check in with you and see if you have seen or received any questions or comments so far about what we're talking about.
Um, Let me take a look. If anybody has any questions specifically, go ahead and put them in now. What have we got?
Why don't we do this? I'll let you look and then I'll continue. And if you have something you'd like to add, that would be fine. Is that going to work?
If I have anything or if anyone messages me directly, I will type it in chat. And
Terrific.
if anybody else would like to chime in here, please ask questions.
I hope so, because this could be, we're talking about tough stuff here. And it's not impossible, but it can be difficult. However, I know that if people think of this all as a long-term investment, it can solve some problems. So we want to cultivate pipelines. And just to make sure you know, this is a pile of extremely photogenic fishing nets, because we're going to be talking about fishing. You're sitting in a nice restaurant someplace close to where you live, and you have the best waiter that you've ever had on the planet, and you start chatting with them. I'm a flirt. I flirt with everybody, and find out that they're finishing up their college degree in something like English, and they know they're not going to find a job right away. So they're going to take a couple years off between now and when they go back for their master's or PhD, or they're going to be living in town for a few years taking care of aging parents. And you kind of look at them and say, even if there's not an opening, say, have you ever considered working for a library? We can't make any promises, but if you wouldn't mind emailing me your resume and here's my card, you can start building up a file of potential candidates wherever you go. So some of the things you need to do to be able to throw that wide net, all stakeholders, all people who work for the library, and all of the people who are on your friends group, your foundation, your whatever your governing board is, they all have a simple library card, quote, business card to share that you can hand to them and say, please send us a email. We don't have an opening right now, but boy, would love to keep you in the loop. So in effect, you turn every stakeholder in your library into a scout, looking for people with those great customer service skills. Also, social media right now, in the statistics I surveyed, 79% of people at all levels in institutions get their job from social media, looking things up online, reading job boards of different kinds at the local and national level. So you want to make sure that your website reflects that information, and that your website, your social media accounts, not only do they look good, but they have a button, they have a place where someone can click, interested in working with us. And then you can say, hey, we love people. This is the benefits of working for us and everything. Maybe you don't have any openings right now, but you want a place where people can send you a PDF of a resume for that time when you do have an opening. Of course, you don't want to make any promises, but I've talked to people and they say, you know, sometimes it's someone who contacted us 3 years ago, and we contacted them and they say, well, what a coincidence. I'm looking for a job. So there's two other groups that we want to look at. People who we sometimes overlook, and I think that's kind of a mistake. And I see a question coming up. I'm going to take a look at the question in the chat box in just a second. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of working with young people and also working with what we might call old people. Okay. Oh, this is one of my favorite issues, and this is the heir apparent, issue. And sometimes it gets ugly. And what happens is that Pat Wagner was hired as the head of reference 20 years ago. Sharp, really good. She had bigger ambitions, but the director at the time who hired her said, Pat, confidentially, just between you and me, when I retire, you're going to be the director. That's what they told this person. And I'm not making this up. It's simply, it happened in another state, right? Far, far away. And so this particular gentleman was told when he was hired as head of reference that the job was his when the director retired. And not only did he have that assumption, but half the staff had that assumption as well. Time went on, another 10 years. The director wasn't going anywhere, but now there was an opening for the assistant director, and he moved up the reference person as the assistant director, and everybody assumed that he was going to be the director. Well, what nobody paid attention to the time is the fact that in this particular state, this being a tax supported agency, you can't simply point to someone and say, hey, you get to be the director. You have to legally and ethically go out and actually tell other people you have a job opening. You have to actually promote the job opening in the general public. You can't just pick, a friend of the family or someone who's been there for a long time. And you have to bring in, even if there's someone on the staff you really want, you have to bring in outside candidates. Well, this is exactly what happened, is that this particular person, when it came time, they were not the person chosen to become the director. And they were devastated. And I know that because I was out there doing training and he took me out for dinner and I almost felt like I was kidnapped because he didn't take me back to my motel for 3 hours because he sat there alternating being very angry and very hurt and talking about this. And so I asked questions as delicately as I could, and I found out, of course, there wasn't anything in writing. Nobody ever heard the director do this. Did he ever check the personnel rules in his county because it was a county library? Did he ever check what his state personnel had to say? Did he ever talk to the state library about these issues as well? And then he said, how in the world do I stay? And I said, that's a good question. He lasted another 6 months. So what I tell people is that if by some chance you, meaning not you personally, your library has been telling people that they can be guaranteed some job if they stay long enough, that's kind of a lie. And it's interesting that that kind of handshake agreement kind of dissolves when new people come in, particularly if you get in someone who's competent in the HR department or a new governing board and they said, we can't make promises like that. So I would say once a year you have kind of a let's get together and talk about difficult personnel issues with an outside lawyer, with whoever are the skilled folks, and they can talk about these issues. And I think it's really important to have qualified people talk about issues of promotion and advancement in front of the whole group at the same time, not pointing at anybody, but giving people the information and apologizing for any past mistakes in communication that might be made. But the fact is, what we're talking about, Tiffany, is almost against the law. And so it's something to check in. And yes, I do run into this for sure. So let's take a look again. And again, any other questions or concerns like this? This is important stuff to talk about. Working with young people and old people and how that plays out in terms of how we deal with folks. Now, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. And my pet peeve has a lot to do with, let's call it generational stereotypes. This whole idea that young people are one way and old people are another, and young people don't have any work ethic. And we went through the snow and it was 6 feet of snow. And, you know, I grew up in this immigrant family, and I probably told this story to you folks before, but my family was from Eastern Europe. And if you complained about anything, my grandmother, God rest her soul, would talk about the Tsar's army and the Nazis and the Russian winter. And every year there were more Russian soldiers and the army was bigger, and every year the snow was deeper, right? And to me, it has nothing to do with age. I wish we could do that kind of audition thing they do on some of these fun programs on television where people only audition the voice and you can't see the person or know anything about them except the voice. So we have to say to people, first of all, it's not about how old or young they are. My mom, when she was in her 70s and early 80s, still would have made an absolutely fantastic employee for any public library I know. She was strong, she was smart, she was clear-headed, she had tons of energy, she spoke several languages, she loved customer service, she loved teenage boys, she um, fanatic about reading and books, just had this go-getter kind of energy and idea. So her age was nothing. On the other hand, I had a boyfriend. I always keep in touch with old boyfriends. I had a boyfriend when he was 19, and we were together when I was in my early 20s. Mark was 19 years old. His talent as a manager was so outstanding. He was actually at 19 the assistant manager of the small town hardware store that he worked with in rural Wisconsin. It's first of all, it's about the person's attitude. It's about their willingness to learn and what abilities they bring to the organization. So let's take a look at these three ideas and realize it's not about age or any stereotypes that people like to lay on different groups, whether we call, you know, the baby boomers versus the millennials and whatever they call people these days. First of all, what I look for in an employee is respect, that they are emotionally mature, that they treat people with courtesy. I used to have a group of people working for me, and the ages ranged from 22 to 70. And people used to compliment me on how gracious and nice my staff was. And I said, I have nothing to do with it. They showed up as full adults. They showed up as people who had basic good manners. And I was proud to work with them. But you know what? That's what I looked for, not just a warm body. And I didn't dismiss them because they were doing something, quote, menial. I was more interested in their qualities as a human being, what some people call emotional intelligence. Second, that they had the two important customer service values. First of all, they were competent at their job. So if somebody had a problem, they could solve the problem. And they were welcoming. So many compliments of our tech people because they not only had great tech skills, but they were like, gee, you made my day. Let me see if we can solve this problem together. Yeah, here it is. Thank you for calling. I get thank you notes from libraries about how great my tech people were. Willingness to learn. I don't care how old someone is, but do they want to learn new things? Now, I say this as someone who's over 65. There are some people I've met in my age group who feel that they are entitled to special consideration because of their age. My joke is the fact they worked someplace for 25 years simply meant that they found the building 25 years in a row. Not necessarily that they had any special skills. So I don't care how old or credentialed or experienced somebody is. If they're not eager in learning new things, they're not going to work for me. And finally, they may have a great attitude and they may want to learn, but whether they're old or young, do they have the ability to apply the learning? And that's where you find different abilities that people have. They may be great in the workshop, but can they actually apply that? So those are the three things I look at regardless of age. Then we have this whole group of people who I think we overlook. And I have this great, I can't remember the name of the kind of fish, but I have this as an image because it's in the shadows. It tends to be overlooked. Military folks. I have worked some with government agencies and particularly in the past with people who have left the military, have come into civilian life and had trouble with the transition because many of the skills they learned in the military didn't work as well in civilian life. And usually all they need is some coaching. It's not that big a deal. Oftentimes they bring discipline, eagerness to learn, consistency. They're great with people, so there's a whole bunch of things there that we look at and how we can work with military people. Retirees, the same thing. And again, it's an age issue. Some retirees, like my mom, you just want to snap them up. Others, yeah, maybe they're a little full of themselves. But let's look at retirees. Most of them that I know would rather be doing something rather than just playing golf all day. But I understand South Carolina's economy is based on all those people playing golf all the time. Um, the stay at homes. And again, that's often where people get their part-timers and they stay at home maybe because not just because of children, but because of taking care of a family member. I had a friend who basically spent the first 25 years of her life after high school taking care cheerfully of a mom with a chronic disease and she had to be home all the time. And then students of different ages as well. Before we look at this last part, let's take a look at this. Very good. Um, what if the library administration or the library board has unrealistic expectations of appropriate salary, perhaps because they don't understand what the job entails? I think the comparison thing is a good place to start, working with your state library and also working online to say, here's examples of 45 libraries in towns exactly our size of the same population and the same budget, and this is what they do and this is how much money it entails, because we still have board members who think of library directors as clerks. I'm working on a project in Wisconsin right now, and this was one of the main issues that came up for them in their trustee training, is that they weren't being able to find quality directors because they weren't treating them like library directors. They were treating them like file clerks, as one of the libraries said. So start with credibility. that you're going to borrow credibility from studies and from people in the business world who can say, this is what we have to do, rather than the false kind of Depression era mentality. So again,
sorry to interrupt.
no,
Incidentally, that's
please.
something that the state library can help you out with. We
Yes.
can certainly offer comparisons to other salaries and job descriptions for directors and other positions across the state. That's something that we are able to support in providing that kind of information, what everybody else in your similar situation is doing. Also,
Yes.
forming library boards, we have a whole position dedicated to talking to library board members about what the library director and staff actually do.
Yes.
We will come
Yes.
to you and talk to your board. Sorry,
Excellent.
continue. We do have about 2 minutes left.
That's okay. We're almost done. And Tiffany, I 100% agree. And it's the advice I give as I go around the country, because exactly that. We have to, just you as an employee of the library might not have the same clout as being able to show hard numbers from around your state. Thank you very much. So here's kind of the summary of what we're going to look at next. First of all, evaluate your library. Is it a good place to work? How are people coming in new going to look at it? Work with your entire community on the sales pitches, not just that you're selling a position in the library, but in effect, you're selling your community. Start tracking potential candidates by throwing that wider net, looking for talent regardless of what position they're in right now. Make sure that the social media is updated to continually invite potential candidates. Continually invite potential candidates. Make sure that you have those orientation and mentoring programs in place, even if you're a very small place. Maybe you have people from outside the library who can mentor people as well. And finally, this is the kind of gold standard for marketing these days. Would people who work for you, those new hires, would they recommend your workplace as a good place for other people to work? Because people talk on those communication boards linked to universities and colleges and library school alumni groups. And you want to be one of those places where, hey, it's small, but it's a terrific place to work and live. So let me turn things back to you, Tiffany. I think we have another minute. Did we have any other questions or comments from the folks attending today?
I haven't got anything else.
Okay.
What other questions do we have from the group? Would anyone like to chime in? Been kind of a quiet group here today. Not seeing anybody jumping in at this time. And it is exactly 3 o'clock. I also will say it is just starting to storm, really ugly looking out there outside my window. So I hope we don't like get hit by lightning and cut off the power or anything. So if anyone has any other questions, perhaps something that you think of later or are, would like to ask more anonymously, you can send them to me or you can send them directly to Pat if you'd like to get her feedback on things. So if nobody has any comments, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and close us out for the day. Thank you so much for joining us.